John Conlon, 45, lived a life that many would call ordinary. Too ordinary, in fact. He worked at a small, upscale restaurant, managing the front of house. By all outward appearances, he was a successful, respectable man, with a decent home and a marriage to Amy, a woman he had been with for nearly 20 years. But appearances were deceiving. Inside, John felt trapped in a monotonous routine that offered him little satisfaction. His marriage had become a lifeless shell, and the thrill of the life he once dreamed about seemed as far away as it had ever been. Every evening he came home, poured himself a whiskey, and sat in front of the television. Amy would be there, preparing dinner, but there was always an uncomfortable silence between them. She was a kind woman, but John no longer found her interesting or attractive in the same way he once had. He had grown accustomed to the dull rhythm of his life, but deep down, a quiet resentment began to build. Amy had her own desires, her own secrets. It wasn't just John's inability to see them that was causing the rift. It was his indifference. He had stopped trying years ago, and now he resented the life he had created. Yet despite this, he never considered breaking the monotony. Instead, he retreated further into his passive discontent, seeking small escapes to fill the void. A drink, a flirtation with the occasional woman at the bar, but none of it was enough. James Depew was a 25-year-old man with the world at his feet. Tall, athletic, and disarmingly charming, James lived a life filled with excitement and ease. Everything that John's life lacked. He wasn't from money, nor did he have a prestigious career, but he had an energy that was magnetic, a personality that made everyone want to be around him. He worked as a part-time personal trainer and part-time bartender, but his charm was his real business. Amy met him at a party, a celebration for a new client at the restaurant where John worked. James had been there, on the edge of the crowd, making everyone laugh, holding court with a captivating presence that no one could ignore. Amy, bored of her stagnant life, was immediately drawn to him. It wasn't just his looks or his flirtations, though they were certainly part of it. It was his sense of freedom. James had a life that didn't seem constrained by responsibilities. He was fun, unpredictable, and most importantly, he made Amy feel alive. Their connection was instant, and it didn't take long for their flirtation to escalate into something more. What began as playful banter over drinks turned into a passionate affair, one that Amy found herself unable to resist. The excitement James brought into her life was intoxicating, and with every secret meeting, every stolen kiss, Amy became more addicted to him. But it wasn't just the thrill of the affair that kept her coming back. It was the deep, growing discontent she felt with her marriage. She began to see John as a figure from her past, someone who had no place in her future. And James? He seemed to be everything John wasn't. Young, full of life, daring, and free. Amy stood at the crossroads of her life. The affair had only deepened her internal conflict. On one hand, she loved John. At least she used to. But now she couldn't remember the last time she felt anything for him that wasn't indifference or resentment. On the other hand, there was James. He made her feel alive again, as though the years of her dull existence had evaporated in his presence. But now, something else was happening. The guilt she once felt when she kissed James had faded into something far more complex. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could have the life she always dreamed of. Free of John's neglect, free of the weight of obligation. It was in one of their many late-night meetings that James dropped a bombshell. "You deserve better than this," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge of something darker. "You deserve freedom. No more looking over your shoulder. No more holding yourself back. John's holding you prisoner. You need to be free of him, permanently." Amy recoiled, unsure if it was a joke or something more serious. "What are you talking about?" she asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "I'm not talking about leaving him," James said, his gaze hardening. I'm talking about getting rid of him. Amy froze. For a split second, her mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. Could he be serious? Was James suggesting murder? She shook her head, unable to even entertain the thought. But as James leaned in closer, his words grew more persuasive, more insistent. He's a burden, Amy. Don't you see that? If he were gone, you could be free. We could be free. The idea was chilling, yet for some inexplicable reason, it didn't repulse her. Instead, it planted a seed of possibility in her mind, a possibility she couldn't unthink. She hadn't even known how much she wanted it until that moment. Could she do it? Could she really kill John to free herself? As the days passed, the idea of getting rid of John gnawed at Amy's mind. She had never imagined herself capable of such a thing, but now the seed had been planted, and it grew with each passing hour. James was insistent. He wasn't just going to let the idea die. He began pushing her further into the plan. It wasn't enough to be lovers anymore. This, to him, was a way to solidify their future together. A future where Amy could escape her suffocating life with John. Think of it this way, James would say. If we don't do this now, nothing will change. You'll stay stuck in that dead-end marriage, and I'll keep moving on. You won't get another chance like this. The more Amy listened, the more she understood. James wasn't just offering her freedom. He was offering her a way out. A way to end it all and start fresh with him. The promise of a life without John felt like the ultimate liberation. But at what cost? Amy had no idea what would come next. She only knew that her world, which had once been constricted by routine and obligation, was now filled with dangerous possibilities. Her silence became her complicity. Amy's hesitation finally broke when she realized there was no turning back. She had already made up her mind, but now she needed to act. She spent the following days in a haze of preparation, mentally rehearsing what she would do. She began to withdraw from John, pulling back from the small conversations they still shared. She no longer cared to be the dutiful wife, the one who cooked, cleaned, and kept the peace. Instead, she was playing a role in a much darker plan. James had suggested that John's death looked like an accident, something clean, quick, and almost impossible to trace back to them. Amy agreed, but inside, the weight of her actions pressed on her, suffocating her with doubt. Could she do it? Could she really take the life of a man she had once loved? The answer became clear. Yes. For the first time in years, she felt empowered. No longer a passive figure in her life, but an active participant in her future. The year was 1931, a time when the world was reeling from the Great Depression. People were struggling to make ends meet, and the daily grind often overshadowed personal struggles. For Amy, the life she had known felt like a prison. She knew no one would understand the secret she carried, not in this small town where gossip was currency and whispers in the streets traveled faster than any telegram. Amy spent her days behind closed doors, growing increasingly isolated. The few letters she sent to friends were always vague. Her life was too perfect to allow for suspicion. But it was in her private moments, when she lay awake at night, that the reality of what she was about to do sank in. Each night, as she stared at the ceiling, her thoughts turned darker. How could she explain this to herself? Could she justify ending a life, especially one she had once vowed to cherish? The thought was chilling, but it became increasingly urgent. On the night of June 12th, 1931, she sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the letter she had written to James. It was short, precise, and void of emotion. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself, but it was clear. The plan was set. She would do it. "I'll make sure it looks like an accident," she wrote. "It has to be quick. He can't survive." This was the moment where everything changed. There was no turning back now. James had been growing impatient. He'd been pushing for action for weeks, but Amy's hesitation had held him back. He was a man who thrived on immediacy, and the longer Amy waited, the more he felt his grip on her slipping. He couldn't afford to let her back out now. On June 15th, 1931, James called Amy again. They had spoken in hushed tones at the local bar once or twice, but now the stakes were higher. There was a calmness in his voice that unsettled her. "Are you ready?" he asked, the words slipping into her ear like a cold whisper. Amy hesitated. She looked at John, who sat at the far end of the room reading the paper, completely oblivious to what was about to unfold. He was lost in the world of news and distraction, the same things that had kept him away from her for years. Her heart raced. This was it. "I'm ready," she whispered back. James had already planned out the details. He told Amy to be prepared to meet him at the nearby woods later that evening. The plan was to wait until John had gone to bed, then make it appear as if a random assailant had come across their property. Amy, he explained, would be the one to start the ruse, pretending she'd been too scared to call the police immediately, giving just enough time for him to do the job. It was perfect. June 17th, 1931, a warm summer evening, felt like any other. The Conlin household was quiet, with only the occasional creak of floorboards as John walked through the living room. Amy, ever the dutiful wife in public, had made a special dinner that night, something she rarely did. The wine flowed freely, and John, slightly intoxicated, was in good spirits. He laughed about the absurdity of the world, the depression, and the news of the day. He had no idea that the end was drawing near. As he stumbled off to bed that night, Amy was already in position. She hadn't spoken a word to him since dinner. Instead, she walked to the window and pulled the curtains tight, peering out. This was it, the night she had been preparing for. Every second felt as though it were dragging on. Her pulse raced. It was just a matter of waiting for the signal. At precisely 11:45 p.m., Amy heard the quiet tap on the window. It was James. She let him in through the back door, making sure not to make a sound. He was calm, collected, but there was something cold in his eyes. There was no turning back. In a hushed whisper, he handed her the weapon, a small revolver that would become the instrument of their betrayal. Amy held it in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the chill of the metal against her skin. She nodded without speaking, her throat too dry for words. James moved swiftly, knowing the precise moment to strike. As John slept, Amy was already out of the room. James entered, aimed, and fired. The shot echoed through the quiet house, a sharp noise that seemed to slice through the air like a scream. The first few minutes were filled with chaos. Amy ran back into the room, screaming for help. She fell to the floor beside John, her hands trembling as she touched the blood. He was still breathing, but barely. His face contorted in pain as he gasped for air. The gunshot had struck him in the chest, but he was alive. For a moment, Amy wondered if he would survive. Panic washed over her as she realized the plan wasn't as foolproof as she had hoped. James was there, standing in the doorway, watching. His expression was unreadable, though Amy could see a flicker of frustration in his eyes. This was supposed to be quick. This was supposed to be clean. "Amy," James said, his voice low but steady. "We have to go. Now." Amy hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't bear to look at John. The man she had been married to for so long, the one she had betrayed, was now lying there, blood pouring from his chest. And yet, there was something almost freeing in the air. She stood up, wiped the tears from her face, and nodded. The next moments passed in a blur. James helped her outside, and they fled into the night, leaving the house behind, leaving John to his fate. Against all odds, John Conlin survived the attack. He was rushed to the hospital, clinging to life. His condition was critical, but there was a spark of hope. The doctors fought tirelessly to stabilize him, but the next few days would be a delicate balance of life and death. While Amy and James believed they had gotten away with it, fate had other plans. June 18, 1931, dawned with a new kind of horror for Amy. She waited for news, but what she didn't know was that John was already regaining consciousness. His mind, though clouded with pain and confusion, began to piece together the events. He remembered the shot, the pain, and something else. A figure. He couldn't fully identify the person, but he had caught a glimpse of James's face, or at least he thought he had. His memory was fragmented, but one thing was clear. The person who shot him was not a stranger. Amy was shaken to her core when the phone rang that morning. The voice on the other end was one she had never hoped to hear. It was John. "I know it was him, Amy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know it was James." In that moment, Amy's world cracked. The cold reality set in. She wasn't free. The walls were closing in. The morning of June 22, 1931 was when everything unraveled. Amy received a call from the police. John had regained enough strength to speak with detectives. He had named James as the shooter. His memory wasn't perfect, but he was insistent. Amy's heart dropped. She tried to remain calm, but her hands shook uncontrollably. She had to see James. She needed to know if he had already turned on her. She met him at a local tavern, a quiet spot where they had shared many secretive conversations. "They know," Amy said in a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. James looked at her with an unreadable expression. "Then we're in this together, Amy. You're not going anywhere." But Amy knew, deep down, that she couldn't trust him anymore. The lies had already started to unravel. And now, with John still alive, she was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. By June 25, 1931, the town was buzzing with whispers about John Conlon's attack. While Amy and James continued to go about their lives, the police were tirelessly working to piece together the evidence. The detective in charge, Inspector Thomas Daly, was a sharp man. He knew there was something off about Amy's behavior, but the key to solving this crime lay in the smallest of details. Amy, though outwardly calm, was beginning to crack. The pressure of living a lie was starting to show. She had been avoiding John's hospital room, not wanting to face him. But the night of June 26th, when she was at home alone, the phone rang again. It was a detective, asking her to come to the station for a statement. "We need to ask you a few questions about your husband's attack, Mrs. Conlon," the voice on the other end said. "Please come down." She hung up the phone, her mind racing. She had always been a good liar, but this was different. She wasn't just lying about something trivial. This was her life on the line. The next morning, she went to the station with a cool exterior, but inside, her thoughts were unraveling. The room felt like a cage, with the walls closing in as the detective asked about her whereabouts the night of the attack. Amy was vague, just like before, but there was something about her that didn't sit right with Inspector Daly. The way she answered, too rehearsed, too perfect. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew one thing. Amy Conlon wasn't telling the whole truth. July 2nd, 1931. John Conlon was still in the hospital, and while his recovery had been slow, his mind was clearer than ever. The doctors had confirmed that he would survive, though he would need a long time to fully heal. But as the weeks passed, the memory of the attack became sharper in his mind. One evening, as he lay awake in his hospital bed, he remembered something crucial. A fleeting glance. Just a moment, but it was enough. He had seen James, or at least the outline of him, standing by the door that night. He hadn't been sure at first, but now it was clear. The details fell into place like puzzle pieces. James had been there, in the shadows, waiting. John was determined to get the truth out of Amy. He knew she was hiding something, but he also knew that he couldn't do this alone. He needed proof. He called a private investigator, someone who could gather information without alerting the authorities. John was determined to find the link between Amy and James. On July 7, 1931, Amy had her first real breakdown. The stress of the investigation, the questions, the pressure. Everything had built up to a breaking point. She couldn't keep up the charade anymore. That evening, James came to visit, as he always did. Amy's house felt like a stranger's place to her now. The walls, once familiar, felt foreign. She paced back and forth in the living room, agitated and unsettled. James sat calmly on the couch, his usual smug expression never faltering. James looked at her, his face hardening for a moment before he softened. He knew the weight of the situation was beginning to press on her, but he also understood that they had to keep up the act. His charming smile returned as he stood and walked over to her, taking her hands in his. "We're in this together," he said, his voice low and comforting. "He won't be able to prove anything. We planned it well, didn't we?" But Amy wasn't so sure anymore. The guilt had started to eat at her, and every time she saw John's face in her mind, once the man she had married, now an invalid, she felt like the walls were closing in. "I'm scared, James," she admitted, her voice cracking. "What if they find out? What if John wakes up and tells them what really happened?" James paused. For a moment, the man she had been involved with seemed far less sure of himself. His calm facade had slipped, revealing a nervousness she hadn't seen before. "Don't worry about that," he said. "The plan is solid. You'll be free and we'll be together. John won't be around much longer anyway." Amy wasn't so convinced. The internal conflict raged inside her, torn between the love she felt for James and the ever-present guilt of what she'd helped him do. But deep down, Amy also knew that her life would never be the same again. Whatever happened next, she couldn't go back. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered more and more of the troubling connections between Amy and James. It wasn't just the letters they had found. There was something else. Something far more dangerous. The private investigator hired by John had uncovered something that no one had anticipated. Financial records showing that Amy had been sending large sums of money to James over the past few months. The funds had been transferred under false pretenses, disguised as payments for an imaginary medical debt. The investigator also discovered Amy and James had been in contact more frequently around the time of the shooting. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Then, on July 15, 1931, the police received a major break in the case. John, now more lucid, identified James in a dramatic moment of clarity. With a steady voice, John spoke to the officers who had come to his bedside. "That man, he's the one who shot me. I remember his face, his eyes. He was there that night." It was a pivotal moment. Despite his weakened state, John's recognition was all the police needed. They had their man. James Depew was brought in for questioning. The trial began in early August 1931, with the press buzzing about the love triangle that had led to a violent crime. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers, eager to hear the details of the scandal. Amy, her face pale and expressionless, sat in the defendant's chair, her eyes downcast. James, now in handcuffs, was seated beside her. Amy's defense attorney argued that she had been a victim of circumstance, coerced into her actions by the manipulative James. She claimed she never intended for John to be hurt, that the shooting was a mistake. But no one bought it. The prosecution, armed with the letters and financial records, painted a damning picture of Amy's involvement. They argued that she had played a pivotal role in planning the attack, her motives driven by her desire to escape her marriage and run away with her lover. In the end, the jury was left with no doubt. James was convicted of the shooting, and Amy, despite her denial of involvement, was found guilty of aiding and abetting him. However, in an unexpected twist, the jury acquitted her of direct involvement in John's death, citing a lack of concrete evidence linking her to the fatal shot. James Depew was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison, his life as a free man now over. Amy, however, walked out of the courtroom a free woman. Her trial was a media sensation, and she was hounded by the press as she left the courthouse. As she stepped into the sunlight, a mixture of relief and guilt washed over her. The world saw her as a victim, but deep down, she knew the truth. She had orchestrated her husband's attack, and although she was free, she could never escape the consequences of her actions. What do you think? Was Amy guilty of murder? Or did she merely fall victim to a web of lies spun by a younger man? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant.